Every graphite artist knows this pain. You finish your drawing, tilt it to the light, and there it is, the shiny glare that ruins everything. But what if I told you that there's a graphite set out there that doesn't shine at all? This is the Faber-Castell Pit Graphite Matte set, and today we're going to find out if this is really the only graphite set that you need. If you want to learn how I created this graphite bird drawing in real time with voiceover as I draw, you are more than welcome to join me on Patreon. I'd love to see you there. You can find the link in the description below. Paper. As for the paper, I'll be using Arches hot pressed watercolor paper because it has a finer texture and I want to see how this set reacts on it, because this is one of my favorites to draw on with graphite. This paper is 185 GCM and it is made out of pure cotton, which gives it that velvety smooth texture I mentioned. With my other graphite pencils, I can achieve a very smooth blending and build up many layers on this paper, so now I want to see if these pencils can do the same. Now let's see what this set is really made of. I just removed the plastic wrap, I didn't even touch them at all, so they're completely new and I'm going to try them for the first time here, now with you. Inside the box we've got 6 pencils, 2B, 4B, 6B, 8B, 10B and 12B. That's a really nice range, enough pencil grace to cover all kind of tonal values. The design is elegant and I really like this combination of black and gold. Even the pencil tip looks noticeably matte and darker than a regular graphite pencil, so that's already a good sign. Aside from those extra characteristics, the overall shape is standard, just like any regular pencil. Shading. Shading was very easy to do. The pencils adhere to the paper quickly and immediately. I only used a 4B pencil for this shading test and it turned out to be much softer than I expected, which made the shading process fast and smooth. There were no unwanted marks and I was able to create an even gradient just by adjusting the pressure on the pencil without any issues. With some other pencils, you can sometimes get visible marks from the pencil tip when pressing harder in the shadow areas, but here everything went perfectly. I also managed to achieve shading with no shine, deep shadows, and a very nice highlight in the light area. Blending. Blending went perfectly as well. I used a soft makeup brush for this, and the pastel texture disappeared almost instantly, blending into the paper's texture and leaving behind a smooth surface with a very gradual transition from dark to light. No streaks or uneven spots to disrupt the smoothness. The pencil pigment mixed beautifully across all areas and the result was a complete success. With these pencils, you can achieve very smooth blending and soft, seamless transitions between tones. I'm sure that if I had added more layers and blended a few more times, the texture would have become even smoother. Erasing. To erase, I used a Tombow Mono Zero eraser and it was very easy to remove the graphite without having to press too hard. The paper's original color showed through even in the darker areas. Although I couldn't completely remove all the pigment there, I was still able to lift most of it, which makes these pencils quite easy to erase. In the lighter area of the circle, I managed to remove all the pigment, which makes sense because I applied less pigment there, so it's naturally easier to erase. I am really sure I would have gotten similar results even with a regular eraser. Highlights. For the highlights, I used the same eraser as before, since it has that pen-like tip that gives me the chance to create very fine textures and small highlights in the narrow areas of the drawing. But honestly, after seeing how easily these pencils erase, I kind of already knew that the highlights are going to turn out great as well. Even during the erasing test, I was basically creating larger highlights if you think about it. So these pencils definitely passed the highlight test as well. You can easily create realistic drawings with strong contrast and detailed textures now that we know how effortlessly highlights can be added using the right tools. Gradient plus shine test. These pencils promise to be matte, but are they really? To test that, I'm going to create a gradient using regular graphite pencils and the Pit Graphite matte set. I'll be using the 2B, 6B and 8B pencils from both sets because my regular graphite set only goes up to 8B, unlike the Pit set, which includes even higher grades. That's why I chose these specific pencils, to keep the comparison fair. This test is going to show us exactly how the pencils from this Faber-Castell Pit Graphite Matte pencil set actually perform and just how different they are from the regular graphite pencils. From the very first strokes, the difference in texture is clear. Regular graphite feels smoother, while the Faber-Castell Pit Matte pencils have a slightly rougher touch on the paper. As you move up in grades, the Pit pencils become noticeably more matte, whereas the regular ones are shiny right away when the light hits them. The regular pencils blend faster and feel the paper's texture more easily, while the Pit ones need a bit more control to keep the shading even and avoid marks from extra pressure. However, the extra care is definitely worth it for that rich, deep matte black result that gives the drawing a more dramatic and refined look. Now let's put them to the ultimate shine test and see how they react when brought close to the light. As you can see, the regular pencils lose their darkness and become flat and very reflective, while the Pit pencils maintain that deep, intense effect. They are still slightly reflective, but it really depends on the angle of the light. If you notice, when I tilt the gradient a certain way, it looks very matte, whereas the regular ones stay shiny from almost every angle. So, Pit wasn't exaggerating. They really are matte. You just have to be mindful of the angle when photographing or filming them. From some angles, they appear extremely matte and deep black, while the regular ones are much harder to capture because they react to light from almost every direction. Ever since I started working with graphite, I always wanted to find a method to get rid of that annoying shine that graphite has. And finally, many years later, that wish came true because I found these pencils. This is a total game changer. We all know how hard it is to film and photograph graphite drawings. If the light hits from the wrong angle, it can completely ruin the drawing, make it seem flat, amateurish, and just kill the contrast. Now let's put them to the ultimate test. A full drawing that's got everything. Shading, blending details, contrast, soft gradients. All the stuff that makes a piece feel realistic. And for this one, I'm drawing a great-teeth bird. It's the perfect subject to show contrast and texture, and it is really going to let us see what these pencils can really do. For the background, I decided to go with a simple gradient. Darker at the top and gradually lighter toward the bottom. I didn't want it to be too strong, just enough so the paper wouldn't stay completely white. Personally, I feel like a background makes a drawing look more complete. It helps the main subject stand out and draws the viewer's attention toward it. To create it, I manually used pencils to apply the pigment and then makeup brushes to push the pigment into the paper's texture and achieve a smooth, soft finish. I didn't want to press too hard with the pencil right away and end up with smudges that would ruin that smooth look, so instead I worked in layers, adding one layer, blending it out with the brushes, and then adding another one, and so on. I prefer building up slowly to get the result I want, rather than rushing and making mistakes that are hard or sometimes even impossible to fix. As I mentioned, I didn't go for anything too complex with the background. I mostly wanted to test out some of the makeup brushes I ordered from AliExpress. And on that note, they were very cheap, but honestly, the quality was surprisingly good. Not premium of course, but definitely great for that price. No matter how much I tried to get rid of all the pencil marks, I couldn't completely eliminate them. That was honestly my fault because I used a pencil gray that was a bit too dark and soft for such a light, smooth background. Still, in the end, I was happy with how it turned out. That texture didn't bother me at all, and I actually liked the bit of character it added to the background. For the base layers, I started with the light areas of the bird. I always like beginning this way because it helps me build up the drawing gradually and keeps the light sections clean. Starting with dark tones too early can easily make things look smudgy or dull, especially in graphite where even a little excess pigment can quickly spread and ruin that soft, clean look. The purpose of the base layers is to establish the main tones, shapes, and direction of the drawing before adding any details. They actually form the foundation that supports everything else. It's like setting the stage. Once your values are in place, the rest of the process becomes much easier and more predictable. I started very lightly, using gentle pressure to lay down the first tones and then gradually built up the darker ones layer by layer. This approach gives much more control and helps keep the drawing clean. It's always better to build up the depth slowly rather than add too much too soon and then have to struggle to lighten it up again. To blend the graphite, I used again those makeup brushes in circular motions. They help even out the pigment and create a smooth, soft texture. Perfect for large transitions and delicate areas like the bird's chest and the wings. As I continued layering and moved toward the darker parts of the drawing, I began using blending stumps, mainly in the smaller and shadowed sections and toward the end of the base layers. The difference between the two tools is quite noticeable. Makeup brushes give a soft, airy blend, ideal for smooth gradients, while blending stumps allow you to push the pigment deeper into the paper's texture and define edges more precisely. I love using both. The brushes keep the tone gentle and natural, and the blending stumps help bring out form and structure where it's needed. Taking the time to blend each layer before adding the next one helped me avoid patchiness and keep the graphite looking consistent. It also gave the drawing that velvety, seamless texture I was aiming for. This stage might seem simple, but it's one of the most important parts of a graphite drawing. The base layers are what makes the final details look refined and cohesive. They set the tone, contrast, and the balance of the entire piece. Once they are done right, everything else just falls naturally into place. The eye of the great-teeth bird is a very small area, but it's one of the most important parts of the whole drawing. It's made up of a dark iris, and to keep it from looking flat, I added a subtle highlight along the edge of the iris so the pupil becomes more visible. Then I created a strong, bright highlight inside the eye to bring it to life instantly. For that, I used the Tombow Mono Zero Eraser again to lift the graphite first, and then I went in with the white color pencils to intensify the highlight and make it pop. I also didn't forget about the tiny bit of skin around the eye. Birds have a sort of upper and lower eyelid all around the eye, and adding that light, soft transition of skin really helps the eye feel more realistic and properly set into the head. For the beak, I used mainly lots of highlights and shadows rather than building too many layers and creating some complicated textures. I used the 12B pencil for the darkest parts to get that deep contrast and the Tombow Mono Zero Eraser for lifting the highlights and shaping the lighter areas. For blending, I used makeup brushes only because the beak has such a soft, smooth surface. The brushes helped me to keep the transitions gentle and gave the beak that subtle, slightly shiny texture that real bird beaks have. Because the beak is such a small feature, proportions are really important. I paid close attention to its size and angles to make sure I didn't make it too small or too large for the head. I completed the beak in one go right after finishing the base layers, since it's a very tiny area and it comes together quickly once all the values are mapped out. For the top of the head, I started by creating the main highlights using the Tombow Mono Zero Eraser and also my electric eraser. These tools really helped me to lift the graphite cleanly and place those soft, natural looking light areas exactly where the feathers catch the most light. After that, I darkened the left and right sides of that section to give the head more shape and depth and to keep the brightest area right in the center. Once the highlights were in place, I went back in between them with a sharpened pencil to add fine textures and subtle feather details. This step helps break up the erased highlights so they don't look like big, empty patches. Instead, they start to look like soft, realistic feathers catching the light. For the white patch on the head, I focused mostly on creating the tiny feathers using small, short pencil strokes. Because this area contains a lot of white in the reference photo, I didn't need to add heavy texture, but I also didn't want to leave it completely flat or pure white. To keep it looking natural, I worked in light layers, slowly building subtle depth so the little feathers still show without overpowering the softness of the area. I used a pencil with a very sharp point for this entire section, especially when defining the edges of the feathers. The way I held the pencil also made a big difference. When adding the lighter, softer feathers, I held the pencil farther back to keep the pressure gentle and the strokes light. For the darker, sharper details, I held the pencil much closer to the tip, giving me more control and allowing me to add crisp, precise marks. This combination of soft strokes and sharper details helped me keep the white patch realistic, textured and consistent with the rest of the head. For the chest area, I had to slow down a bit because this is where the bird has the most highlights within the darker feathers. To get those bright, shiny effects, I started by lifting the graphite with a Tombow Mono Zero Eraser. The Tombow helped a lot in removing just enough of the dark pigment to make space for the stronger highlights that come afterwards. Because I used a 12B pencil in this area, the graphite was very dark and dense, so going directly in with the electric eraser or white pencil wouldn't have given me the clean, intense highlights. The Tombow acted as the perfect first step to clear the pigment without damaging the paper. After that, I used the electric eraser and the white color pencil to create the very intense highlights and give the feathers that glossy, shiny look they have in the reference photo. It was a bit tricky at first to create such tiny feathers shapes with the electric eraser, but once I cut the eraser tip into a sharp pencil-like point, it became much easier to add fine, precise lines. My goal here was to recreate that shiny feathers effect in the darker part of the chest, where the light hits the feathers just right. All those lifted highlights and touches of white pencil added just enough texture and depth to make the chest feathers look alive. I also noticed afterwards that my lighting setup was a bit off in the early stages of this drawing, which made some of the dark areas appear shinier than they actually were. Once I realized that, I adjusted my lighting and corrected the values so the dark feathers looked as intense and deep as they were, without that unintended shine. For the left and right wings, there really wasn't much visible information in the reference picture since the bird was photographed from the front. Because of that, both wings are quite small and mostly made of a dark tone with a very few subtle highlights. On the left side, I also worked a little on the feathers between the head and the wing, adding some middle tones to better connect those two areas and make the transition feel more natural. The tiny right wing was a bit challenging at first, especially when trying to add some texture in such a limited space, but with the help of the electric eraser and a very sharp pencil tip, I managed to get those small details in place. As I mentioned, the wings are barely visible here, so there wasn't much work to be done here, but the 12B pencil really helped me achieve a deep, intense black that makes the wings stand out just enough so they don't disappear into the drawing. For the dark line in the middle of the belly, the 12B pencil from this set was incredibly useful. This area is a very intense, solid black in the reference photo without any visible details, so the 12B pencil allowed me to fill it in quickly and effectively. I pressed down firmly to completely cover the paper's texture and make that section as deep and uniform as possible. However, in the places where this dark line meets the lighter areas on the left and right sides of the body, I made sure the transition wasn't harsh or abrupt. Instead, I gently pushed the graphite outward into the lighter region, creating small strokes that suggest feathers overlapping from one area into the other. This helped the dark and light section to blend naturally and keep everything looking cohesive, as if all the feathers belong to the same smooth, continuous surface. For both sides of the body, I started by adding the first layers of feathers texture on top of the base layers I had already put down. The feathers in this part of the bird are extremely small, almost like fur, which is why the texture can easily look more like tiny hairs instead of large feathers. To keep everything accurate, I worked with a very sharp pencil, followed the natural direction of the feathers carefully, and made sure to match the contrast and flow seen in the reference photo. Just like in the other areas, I worked from light to dark. This gave me room to adjust or correct the tones if something didn't look right before committing to the darker values. In the reference, you can clearly see how the feathers become darker toward the outer edges on both sides of the body. This creates a beautiful gradual contrast, so I built that slowly, layer by layer, instead of jumping to the darker tones too soon. Since I see great-teeth birds all the time where I live, I've always wanted to draw one, and it turned out to be the perfect subject for testing this graphite set. The set promises deep matte blacks, and considering how many dark areas this bird has, it allowed me to really push those tones and see what these pencils can really do. Throughout both sides of the body, I constantly kept the pencil sharp to create clean, delicate feather strokes. For highlights, I used again, guess what, the Tombow Mono Zero eraser and the electric eraser, depending on how strong or subtle I needed the highlights to be. The Tombow worked great for lifting small, gentle highlights, while the electric eraser was perfect for intense, bright spots that needed to stand out against the darker feathers. Working on both sides also required paying attention to how the feathers overlap and connect. Even though these areas are small, taking the time to build the texture gradually helped keep everything looking realistic and prevented the drawing from becoming patchy or chaotic. This slow, layered approach made both sides of the body flow naturally into the rest of the drawing. For the tail, legs, and the branch, most of the work came down to creating strong shadows and clean highlights, since these areas in the reference photo don't contain that much texture. I started with the tail, adding deep, dark shadows while preserving the thin highlights between the feathers. To create the softly lit feathers, I used a kneaded eraser to gently lift some of the graphite. This type of eraser is perfect for subtle highlights because it removes pigment without leaving harsh edges. After that, I went back in with a 12B pencil to deepen the shadows even more so that the highlights would really pop against the dark background. From there, I moved on to the legs. Just like the tail, they didn't require much texture, mainly a balance of strong shadows and well placed on the left leg. I made sure to keep that bright highlight next to the tail to clearly separate the two areas and prevent them from blending into each other visually. The claws were drawn very dark as well, and the 12B was incredibly helpful for achieving that intense black. Finally, I worked on the branch. I applied a layer of graphite and blended it using a blending stump to create a smooth base layer. Then, I added shadows underneath the little feet to ground the bird properly, followed by a few quick details with a sharp pencil and a Tombow Mono 0 eraser. This prevented the branch from looking like a plain shaded cylinder and added just enough texture to keep it interesting without drawing attention away from the bird. For this drawing, I ended up using almost every pencil in the set, but the 10B and especially the 12B pencils were the stars of the process because of the amount of deep, dark areas that needed coverage. The softer grades helped with the lighter feathers, shading and transitions, while the darker grades were essential for achieving those rich, black and crisp contrasts throughout the drawing. So is this the only graphite set you need? If you love those deep and dark contrasts, this might be the perfect graphite set for you. Faber-Castell didn't make just another regular graphite pencil, they kind of fixed it. No shine, no glare, just pure graphite. I think I'm honestly in love with this set. If you want to learn how I created this graded bird drawing in real time with voiceover as I drew, you are more than welcome to join me on Patreon. I'd love to see you there. You can find the link in the description below. If you liked this video and enjoyed it and learned something from it, please give it a like and comment to tell me what you think about it. And also subscribe to my channel not to miss any of my further videos. Thank you for watching, and again, let me know in the comments, have you ever tried any kind of matte graphite pencils?